Hi, this is Beth Billings from Around the Table Yarns. Today we are doing the knit block of the month from Michelle Hunter's Building Blocks pattern. I have it right here to show you. And the Building Blocks pattern is 12 blocks that can be done individually as squares for a washcloth or a dishcloth, or they can be knitted in strips and sewn together to make a blanket. So we're on block 8 of 12 because it's August. And today I'm going to show you the slip stitch pattern that is used to make block 8. Here is my block number 8. Already begun. And just to review some of the steps that you take before you get to this point, you cast on the number of stitches, the same number of stitches for every block. But because the blocks have different stitch patterns, we sometimes have to alter that number as we go. So in this case, I cast on the required number of stitches, and I worked the first 6 rows in seed stitch. Seed stitch is knit 1, purl 1 across the row. And then when you turn to come back, you're going to purl the knit stitches and knit the purl stitches as you see them. So I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So you knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 all the way across, and then you turn to the other side. And if you see a knit stitch, so in this case, when you turn to the other side, you start and you see a purl stitch, a knit stitch, and a purl stitch, and a knit stitch. And the way that I can tell, a friend once told me a really great trick for keeping track of your stitches, and that is that the purl stitches look like they're wearing a little turtleneck, and the knit stitches look like they're wearing a little V-neck. So the first 4 stitches here are in seed stitch still, and you can see that this one's wearing a little turtleneck, this one's wearing a little V-neck, that one has his turtleneck, and this one has his V-neck. You can pull it down a little bit if it makes it easier to see. Is there a loop or the top of a loop across the bottom of that stitch, or does it have a little bit of a V? So in this case, I would knit this purl stitch, purl this knit stitch, knit this purl stitch, purl this knit stitch. So let's do that. Starting with a knit, coming to a purl, knit, purl. I'm going to place the marker because that's the edging, and then I'm going to purl to the end of the row. When I get to the end of the row, before I have 4 stitches, before the last 4 stitches, I can place another marker, and then I'm going to resume my seed stitch. So every even numbered row of this pattern in the center is done like this, with seed stitch and then purl all the way across, and then you go back to the right side. The first row has 4 seed stitch stitches, and then a make one at the beginning, the first stitch after your border, the first stitch after the marker, and the last stitch before the marker. So I just want to demonstrate that technique because it's the knit in the front and the back. So again, I pick up my knitting and I check to see if I'm going to do a knit stitch or a purl stitch first. As you can see, this one is wearing a V neck, so that's a knit stitch facing me. So I'm going to purl the knit stitch, and once I know what the first one is, I should be okay for the rest of them. If I see a purl, a knit, a purl, a knit, I'm going to, a knit, a purl, a knit, a purl, I'm going to purl, knit, purl, knit. So I see a knit stitch and I purl it. I see a purl stitch and I knit it. I see a knit stitch and I purl it. I see a purl stitch and I knit it. I slip my marker, and if this were row 1 of the pattern, in the very first stitch, I would do a make one in the front and back. To do that, I put my right needle into the stitch as usual and wrap and bring the stitch through, but not off of the left needle. Instead of taking it off, I maneuver the tip of my right needle so that it touches the left tip, and I run it down and then into the back leg. So you can see I've run it into the back half of that stitch. I wrap as usual, and I bring the needle back through the loop that I just ran it down into. When I do that, before I take this off, you can see that there's a horizontal bar that when I do finally take my left needle out, that bar remains. And so some people call this the bar increase. So I'm going to do that at the first stitch again of the first row and the last stitch of the first row before I do my seed stitch border. After your first row, where you've done your increase here and here, you'll do that even numbered row, the row number 2, where you do seed stitch and purl all the way back and then seed stitch. And then we'll be ready to do a right side row of the pattern. And all of the right side rows incorporate a setup number and an ending number of stitches, and then a repeat of 6 stitches in the middle. So I am currently on row 11, which is the same as row 2. Sorry. It's the same as row 7, sorry. So I'm going to do a setup number of stitches, and then I'm going to do my slip stitch pattern. So this is how the slip stitch pattern works. You may remember that to slip a stitch, you put the right needle into the next stitch on the left needle as though to purl it with the yarn in back, and then you just simply move it off of the left needle onto the right needle with no further effort. That is a traditional, typical slip stitch. So if you read in a pattern to slip a stitch, that's what you're supposed to do. However, in this case, the designer wants us to create this horizontal line of yarn. And so we're going to do it just a little bit differently. So I'm going to put that stitch back. And what the designer tells us to do is to move the yarn with yarn in front, WYIF, with yarn in front. So we move the yarn as though we were going to purl the next stitch. We slip it as if to purl. We slip the next one as if to purl. And then we move the yarn back, not too tight, not too loose. And then we knit 4. I'm going to do it again. Move the yarn to the front of the work, slip a stitch purlwise, slip a second stitch purlwise, move the yarn back to the back side of the work, and then knit across. Or knit 4, sorry. Yarn forward, slip, purlwise, slip, purlwise, lay the yarn backward, back to the back, and knit 4. You want to keep those as even as you can. Blocking will help. And you can see that what's happening is we're creating a zigzag pattern across. Yarn forward, slip 2, yarn to the back, knit 4. Yarn forward, slip 2, yarn to the back, slip 4. Yarn forward, slip 2, And in this case, it does not end with the same number of 4, it ends with just 1 stitch, and that's what it's supposed to do. Now we come to the other half marker or the other side marker, and that tells us it's time to do our seed stitch again. So again, I'm looking at a knit stitch, a purl stitch, a knit stitch. If it looks like it's a purl and you don't think it should be, pull down a little bit, and then you can see that, oh yeah, that really is a knit stitch and a purl stitch. So again, if I see a knit stitch, I bring my yarn forward and purl it. If I see a purl stitch, I take my yarn to the back and I knit it. And that should keep your seed stitch nice and even on the edges. When I turn on the very last row, we've talked about the starting and the middle, and now we're going to talk about the last row of the pattern. Remember, we added a stitch at each end. In the last row of the pattern, we're going to be purling back on the very last row, and we're going to stay in seed stitch for the first and the last 4 stitches. So again, I see a purl stitch and I knit it. I see a knit stitch and I purl it. But now I want to lose that extra stitch. So I'm simply going to purl 2 together, the first stitch after the marker. And when I get to the other side, I'll purl 2 together the last 2 stitches before the marker, before I finish the seed stitch. Then I will complete the block with 6 more rows of all seed stitch from after this. So I'll finish this row with the purl and then seed stitch at the end with that decrease right here. Then I'll turn it over, and that will be my first of 6 rows of seed stitch. So that's how you do block number 8. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please contact us at info@aroundthetableyarns.com or 216-230-9224. We're always happy to help, and we'd always love to hear from you. The next block of the month will be in September and will be block number 9. Next week, it's Sock Club, and we will be doing the second half of the Christmas stocking. Thanks again. Bye-bye.